you found our live broadcast today on our Facebook page, congratulations. You are the first live audience for one of these things. Like everyone these days, we're learning how to use technology to continue to do our work since we are, as you can see in the upper corner there, in day 40 of quarantine. And so we hope you'll be patient with us as we learn how to use this software. We've done a dress rehearsal, so we think it's going to run smoothly. Today, our live stream program features an interview with Nina Ignaczak, who is the founder and editor of Planet Detroit, which is a newsletter that comes out every week here in Southeast Michigan. They cover all the environmental stories that are happening in Detroit, Metro Detroit, and around our state. Nina has been a journalist in Southeast Michigan for quite a few years. You've probably read and seen her work, whether you realize it or not. And Planet Detroit, to my knowledge, and Nina, I know you'll correct me if I'm wrong. Excuse me. To my knowledge, Planet Detroit is the only news publication out there right now that focuses only on environmental stories in Southeast Michigan. Is that right?
In Southeast Michigan, yeah, I think that's true. There certainly are other publications that focus just on environmental news, but I think we're unique in that we're one of the few across the country that really focus on environmental news locally.
That's great. So Nina, thank you for being on the first ever Voices for Earth Justice Live. And I want to ask you right out of the gate, Planet Detroit, you're coming up on your 1-year anniversary. Is that right? Of starting Planet Detroit? Mm-hmm. So congratulations on that. So tell us how the idea for Planet Detroit came about and why you started it.
It's something that I had thought about doing for years. I really loved writing about the environment. My background was in environmental science. Before I worked as a journalist, I worked as an environmental planner, working with local communities on parks planning and watershed management and all of that kind of stuff. And but always felt the pull to write. And so this to me is kind of like joining together all of the things that I've loved to do and cared about in my life. And working in the journalism field is a little bit of a dicey proposition these days because there's not a lot of funding for media. So I've found kind of a niche as a freelancer. And I think that the opportunity to try to create your own thing, your own publication, and support yourself that way is a solid way to go as a writer these days.
And you, now Brian Allnut, who is also supposed to be with us today, but he's not feeling well. Brian is also a journalist. Mm-hmm. He's written for a lot of news publications here in Southeast Michigan. How did you and Brian meet? And tell me about the process of hatching this idea together and cooperating.
So I've known Brian for a few years. I've edited several publications and hired him as a freelancer. And he's always been very solid, responsible, good writer. And I know that he had a knack and an interest in the environment. He actually was one of the owners of Detroit Farm and Garden back when it was down in Southwest Detroit. And he's written a lot in the environment. So when I was looking around for somebody to help me get this thing out every week, because I soon realized that actually trying to write a newsletter on my own every week, in addition to all of the other work that I do, was probably more than I could bit off more than I could chew. He was able to come on and help me produce the newsletter every week.
Yes, and it is a weekly newsletter. So you have published coming up on what, 52?
I guess so. Issues. Yep.
Yeah, 52 issues. And what would you say? Is there so much environmental news in Southeast Michigan that you have to cut stories out, or?
Yeah, there definitely is. There's people. Somebody asked me when I started this, is there enough news to cover every week? And yes, there definitely is. There's stories that we don't deal with every week. The newsletter is more of an aggregator, we call it in the media field. So we pull together stories on different topics and try to bring them together in one place and do a little bit of background and explaining so that people can kind of catch up on the news. And then in addition to that, more and more in the last couple of months, especially, we've been doing some of our own original reporting.
So what, when you started and as this has developed, I mean, what would you say you hope to accomplish with Planet Detroit?
I hope to increase the amount of coverage that environmental topics get in the region. I think that it tends to be a secondary topic for a lot of people, with issues like climate change becoming more and more, well, basically the issue of climate change becoming more and more immediate. I felt that we needed to have an outlet that would allow us to understand how this plays out locally in our backyard, and not just like sort of thinking of this as an issue that affects someone else. We have a strong focus on environmental justice reporting, and I think that's another area that has historically been underserved and underreported. So I felt like there was an opportunity to raise the existing coverage and explore some new areas and increase the depth and amount and quality of that content.
That's awesome. Now, I'm going to ask you to define a term. I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of people here, if they're watching this on Facebook, know what this means. But I just had a conversation this afternoon with a group of people that may not. When you say environmental justice, what does that mean to you?
Well, to me, that means whether populations are bearing the burden of pollution equitably. And so to me, it's a little strange that we say environmental justice, because it's really, in a lot of cases, we're talking about environmental injustice, where populations are predominantly poor, predominantly people of color, are concentrated in areas where there's a higher degree of air pollution, where water systems are not maintained, where they may have less access to heating and cooling, and so are more vulnerable to heat waves and and flooding and the things that we're going to see more and more with climate change.
Now, let me ask you this. Did you always have a passion for this, or is this something that you developed over time? Take us through the process of how this became something that you wanted to devote so much of your life to.
I think that earlier in my career, when I was working with local governments and in urban planning, primarily in the suburbs, there was a lot of focus on restoring native landscapes and recreation and things that kind of framed the environment as an amenity and as a nice to have thing in communities. It's great to have trails. It's great to have places to go hiking. But I don't think that, I think especially in Southeast Michigan, because we're so segregated in the way that we're organized where we live, the people that were working on those kinds of issues were very much separated from people who are working on issues about environmental justice. And I think that it's really a shame. And in most cases, people who care about the environment are going to be on the same page with a lot of this stuff. And so I would say it was something that sort of nagged at me early on and became more and more prevalent the more and more I saw about how things are really happening.
So you started Planet Detroit about a year ago, and this becomes an extension of your personal passion and purpose here. How has it grown? Tell us about what things have been like for Planet Detroit over the last year.
It really kind of surprised me. I decided one day to just launch the newsletter and just make it happen, because I'd been thinking about it and plotting it and kind of putting it off to the side. And as soon as I did, I was really surprised with how many people not only signed up, but went out of their way to contact me and say, "Wow, we really need this. This is something that nobody's doing, that's important and needs to be done." So that kind of kept me going in the beginning, thinking, well, maybe I'm not the only person that thinks this is a good idea. And then it's just steadily grown, and the membership has grown. It's not huge yet, but I think it's definitely something that we can build. We've been approached to partner with a variety of organizations on projects and different things. We've been awarded some grant funding to do some reporting on not only environmental justice, but citizen science. So we're looking forward to that. And that's all been a little bit up in the air because the pandemic hit. Sort of trying to figure out how to retool using these kind of digital tools to try to do some community engagement around that. But, all in all, it's kind of exceeded my expectations. And I really do think that there's an opportunity and a potential to build it into a true news organization.
Do you, if it grows into a true news organization, which, I mean, don't sell yourself short. You are a true news organization now, but I think I know what you mean. Would the focus continue to be on Metro Detroit?
I don't know. I mean, I think there's a few ways we could go. I certainly think there's opportunity to do more storytelling across the state of Michigan. And we do some of that now, but we focus mostly on Detroit. There are other news organizations, kind of topical organizations like ours that just focus on specific cities. So, potentially maybe there could be a Planet Cleveland at some point, or Planet, I don't know, Indianapolis, getting out of the Midwest. So that's all I think still like years down the road.
Yes.
At this point, I'm hoping that we are able to sustain ourselves for another couple of years. We have a fiscal arrangement with the Michigan Environmental Council. And so we don't really have to create our own entity, our own legal entity immediately in order to operate. But at some point, we're assembling an advisory group and doing some strategic planning to try to get ourselves sort of to figure out what is next for us.
Yes. In the scroll at the bottom of the screen, I put the Planet Detroit web address, planetdetroit.substack.com, right? Yeah. People can go there to subscribe if they haven't already, and they really, really should, because Brian and Nina are excellent journalists, and I've known their work for many years. And I think Planet Detroit is about as good a source of justice news as you can find anywhere. And I subscribe. And Voices for Earth Justice sponsors Planet Detroit because we believe in what they're doing, and we want our voices to also have ears and eyes to read and hear what they are publishing at Planet Detroit. So if you haven't subscribed, you need to go subscribe right now, or as soon as this live stream is over. I want to switch gears a little bit, Nina, and you have your finger on the pulse of environmental news here in our city, in our region, in our state right now. Tomorrow is Earth Day, as you know, and a lot of us were planning one kind of celebration for the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And then COVID-19 changed that pretty quick. And so I'd just like to ask you, what do you think are the big environmental justice stories right now in our city and region, the things that we should be paying attention to and talking about?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that hasn't really been widely reported yet is that the flooding in Jefferson Chalmers on Detroit's east side is underway. It started. We expected it to be starting. It began last year. They've had quite a few floods in Jefferson Chalmers, and over the years they've done a variety of infrastructure improvements to try to address those. But with the record high Great Lakes levels that we're seeing now, it's just very hard. And I know the city was trying to get in front of it with these floating tiger dams, they're called. So they're like these big floating tubes, and they're supposed to create a dam and keep the water out. But I've heard some reports, and I'm trying to find out more information about what's happening over there. And that's a neighborhood, very low income. People are very resilient there. They're putting in solar panels. They're trying to create their own kind of self-sufficiency within that area. There's farms. There's a outdoor educational venue there created by Manistee Treehouse. But they've also had to deal with, losing their furnaces and whatever's in their basement and their washers and dryers because their basements flood when it gets wet there. So that's definitely one of the issues that we've got our eyes on right now. We just finished a piece about, let's see what we've got here. We looked at how the urban farming community is adapting to COVID in the city. And I think that food access is going to continue to be an increase in importance as an issue. We've probably all seen these reports of food lines at food banks and things like that. The organization Keep Growing Detroit has been working for years to establish what they call food sovereignty, so that the ability of Detroiters to feed themselves through producing their own food. And they're having to adapt. This is the time of year that they hand out all of their compost and seedlings and transplants, and it's kind of a communal celebratory affair, and they're having to really change up how they do that to maintain social distancing, which is definitely created a hardship for them. Likewise, other urban farms in the city that may cater to restaurants have seen their market basically evaporate. So they're changing their plans. They're looking more towards developing community-supported agriculture and, pick up a box of produce and that kind of thing to try to keep them going. So those are two of the things we're looking at. Back to the flooding issue, we're looking at what's happening on Belle Isle. It's already flooding on Belle Isle as well. And we've also got our eye on the Revere Dock collapse on the Detroit River, which you may have remember hearing about. Back in December, there was a dock that collapsed, and there was some information that turned out to not be true, that there was uranium on the site, because it had been used as I'm going to get it wrong. I think it had been used as a missile construction or some kind of construction during the Cold War.
World War II. That was part of the. There was a plant there that was part of the Manhattan Project. So they were processing uranium or doing something with uranium at that site.
There was uranium on the site, but the testing that they showed that there was not any kind of detection over background radiation levels. However, there are other toxins on the site, like PCBs that have been buried as per what the requirements were for mitigation. But if the water infiltrates that site more, potentially those toxins could be at risk of being mobilized into the Detroit River.
Right. And the water intake for Detroit is downriver from that site. Is that
it is,
correct?
But it's sort of across the people that we've talked to. I mean, we're not sure to what extent they're downplaying the risk, but if there was a flushing, it would be so fast. And they've tried to downplay the risk, but there still is, I think it still is an issue, and people are right to be worried about it. I know that the Sierra Club and other groups have worked to try to create a Detroit River Protection Ordinance that would require a certain amount of inspections on these sites around the river and inventory of what the conditions are and what the potential risks are. And I think that's going to be more and more important if we see these high lake levels continue. The city did tell me that they don't think that the spring floods are going to affect that site because they didn't last year, but I guess I'm not quite sure what the basis for that is. So we're looking into that right now too.
Who owns the site?
The site is owned by Revere Dock.
By Revere Dock. And are they making repairs? Have they been forced to make repairs to that bulwark there?
They have a mitigation plan, and supposedly they're executing it. How that's been progressing during this COVID-19, I think we don't really know. I'm guessing very little has been done, but we don't know for sure. There had been work earlier this year, and there was also a sinkhole developing on the property earlier this year too.
Really?
So we don't know exactly what's going on with that now. The city of Detroit did put up a website that we're going to be linking to next week in the story, hopefully. but you can go to their website and find it now, that updates and all of the city's actions about the project, about the site. So there's a list of documents there you can read, and there's a list of orders and activities the city's undertaken. When I last looked at that site a couple of days ago, it hadn't been updated since March 30th.
Is the city responsible for the inspection and oversight of that site?
No, they're not responsible for compliance with environmental regulations.
Okay.
That's EGLE,
That's Eagle.
Environment and Great Lakes and Energy. But the city is nevertheless involved because it certainly affects their operations and what happens in the city. So
that's something to watch. Can we go back to the flooding in Jefferson Chalmers for a second? How many people do we think could be affected by this? And you mentioned flooded basements. Can you talk about how many people might be affected? And
I don't know as much. I don't know right now exactly what's happening, other than one of the streets had about a foot of water on it yesterday. There's certainly hundreds of people living in that neighborhood, hundreds of homes. It's hard to say how many could be infected. I don't know that I don't know if the water's going in the basement or not at this point. As long as the water is flowing. So what happens there is the water overtops the canals and flows over people's properties and into the storm drains, which is not an ideal situation, obviously. But at least if it keeps moving, it's less likely to be an issue. But it also can then infiltrate into basements, which is what certainly causes a lot of property damage and economic damage.
Right. Do people in that neighborhood have flooding insurance? I mean, do you know if people are going to be covered when this happens?
No, people generally don't have flood insurance. It's not really an area. There had been talk last year of the Army Corps of Engineers designating that as a flood zone and requiring flood insurance. But that hasn't, to my knowledge, materialized. And it would most likely be just another kind of onerous cost that may or may not pay off for the people living there.
So it sounds like flooding, obviously, the Great Lakes are at the highest level they've ever been on record. Is that right? I think they've never been higher. So that's leading to more water flowing down the Straits of Detroit, and the water rises. Folks in Jefferson Chalmers, flooding is becoming an issue for those homes, and it sounds like that area has never been designated as a flood zone before.
Correct.
And therefore, people there don't have flood insurance. So we've got this situation where if their basements flood and there's extensive damage to their homes, that they're stuck with the bill for remediation and repair. At the same time, what do we know about? And you probably don't know anything about this, but I mean, with layoffs and unemployment hitting Detroit, especially hard because of COVID-19, I imagine people who live over there are in the same situation as a lot of us. They've lost jobs, they've lost income.
Yeah, this is definitely not something that they need on top of everything else we're all dealing with.
Yeah,
but I do believe that they most likely expected it. The city, of course, anticipated this and is installing those dams. So I'm trying to sort of figure out, if the dams are just failing or if the threat is too great. But it is happening again.
Yeah. So if we could for just a second, I'd like to talk about COVID-19 as an environmental catastrophe. Have you given any thought to this? And are people treating this as an environmental catastrophe?
I mean, it's certainly a natural disaster, in my opinion. It's not an altogether unpredictable one. I think we knew that this was coming. Scientists and government knew this was coming, and we're just sort of woefully unprepared for it. I would also say that in a situation like this, other environmental stressors like flooding and like air pollution become worse and more impactful for people. So, if you're dealing with flooding during a time of COVID and you can't do laundry in your house, you have to leave your house to do your laundry. If it shorts out your electricity, then you're going to have to deal with that. Likewise, if you live in a neighborhood where you've been exposed to a lot of air pollution over many years, there's definitely been some strong studies. They're preliminary, but they showed a pretty clear correlation between COVID severity and air pollution exposure over time. So I think that, it's certainly, while being maybe the way that we kind of use words to frame things, a public health crisis, it's an environmental health crisis as well, and it interacts with those environmental stressors that we see.
Yeah. So the flood situation that you described, air pollution. What I hear you saying is that COVID-19, which is it is an environmental disaster. It's a natural disaster in its own right, but the way that it is interacting with other environmental problems is compounding things for people who are especially vulnerable.
Exactly.
Because of those other environmental problems. So if you could attempt to look into the future, and wanted to have this conversation with you today, not only people know what they're reading about right now, people who care about this know what they're seeing right now, but let's look ahead. Let's say 6 months, or to the end of this year. What do you think is going to be in the news? What are we going to be talking about as all this plays out over the next 6 months to the end of the year?
Well, not having a crystal ball, some of the things that I expect to kind of be repetitive issues that will come up again that we reported on last year. After the flooding comes the heat, and to what extent will we be having heat waves in Detroit, and how will that play out in neighborhoods that don't have access to sufficient air conditioning and cooling opportunities, and how will that, we don't know what's going to happen with the virus, if it's going to go away or kind of take a step back during the summer months. We all hope it will, but if it doesn't, how is that going to impact people? Will our electricity grid be able to keep up with demand as we go into the hot days of the summer? So that's kind of what we're thinking about in the near future. Towards the end of the year, I think right now we're all just a little bit worried about the second, this idea of second peak, and continue to exacerbate issues that we're seeing. We did a short little data story last week that showed the air pollution over the city. It was actually road, Detroit, Cleveland, Toledo. And it's pretty amazing how much less air pollution there is, mainly because we're driving less.
Yes.
A little bit because of factory production. But if you look at Cleveland compared to Detroit, especially, Cleveland's air is a lot cleaner. Detroit's got
really
as well, but there's still a concentration of what they measure nitrogen dioxide in Southwest Detroit, because those power plants and everything are still running down there. So, I read an article today about Milan in Italy, and how they are trying to close the streets to cars over the summer to try to maintain some of the air pollution benefit that they've gained over the shutdown, in part because they know that it will help people fight the virus.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that right?
So I don't know.
Do you think
here, but
yeah. I mean, do you hear of anyone suggesting that we do something similar to that here in Detroit or anywhere in the United States?
I think there's certainly people that suggest it, especially transit and mobility advocates. They've been suggesting it for years.
Yeah.
But it certainly is. I don't know. It's not scientific, but I do feel like the stars are brighter. The air just feels the sky looks a little brighter these days. I'm not sure if I'm just imagining that because I know that the data says that we have less air pollution.
Yes.
Or if it's really true, but it's kind of nice to see it.
Yes.
And we may not have otherwise seen in our lifetimes.
It is certainly. I mean, if we think about it for a second, has there ever been a time since we've been alive, since our parents or grandparents have been alive for that matter, that everything stopped to the point that that map you're referring to, an article that you had in Planet Detroit. That's my son in the background, by the way. The article you had with the map, right, of air pollution, right? Nothing like this has ever happened before in our lifetime, has it?
No.
I mean, I can't. The closest thing I can come to is 9/11 when they grounded the airplanes for a while, but everything else went on.
Yeah.
So, do you think that here's what a lot of my friends have been talking about is, I mean, do you see any signs that we as a society are going to learn something from this or take something from this so that we change some things as a society?
I mean, I would like to think that, but then I see things like the protests at the in Lansing last week, and people sort of just othering and blaming. It's just a Detroit problem. It's not our problem, and we have to get back to work at all costs. And I don't know. I mean, obviously, we have to get back to work. We can't let the economy collapse, and we don't want to be destitute. But I do hope that it gives some people an opportunity to just take a pause and maybe reassess some priorities in their lives. I know it has for me. So
yeah.
So I mean, I don't know. So many things seem to be going in the other direction. But on the other hand, I did see an article today and I haven't looked into it deeply, but saying that GM's going to be running on renewable energy in 3 years. So
100%.
That's what it said.
Wow, that's
I
certainly big news. That's big news.
There's a way, and this reliance on fossil fuels has just played out, but there's still enough of a lobby that we've kept it going for this long, and it needs to stop.
Yeah,
and we need to start thinking a little bit more about these equity issues. And I think that the impact of COVID on Black populations in Detroit is evidence of that, and across in other cities. We live in a very inequitable society where people who have these exposures and don't have access to healthcare and have to be frontline workers are going to be hit much harder. Those people who do not.
How do you think? Last couple of questions here, and I guess they're the $1 million questions. You and I, hope I'm not giving anything away. You and I both live in the suburbs, right? We're both professionals that, white collar.
You like it more than I do.
What's that?
I think you like it more than I do.
I can't complain, but we live in the suburbs. We're in professional white collar families, I guess you could say, and yet we care about this work. We believe in this work that we do. The nut that I've been trying to crack for the longest time, you kind of brought it up yourself when you were talking about the protesters. You said, and I quote, "Oh, it's a Detroit problem, right?" And
one of the signs that I saw a picture of it.
Yeah, and so I guess from my point of view, if there's anything that there are a lot of things that I hope we learn as a society from this, but that's one that I really wish deep down in my heart of hearts that we would learn most from this is how the choices that we make affect other people's lives in real ways that we wouldn't like if we were the ones that were being affected, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you can help me with something I've been struggling with for years. How do we get people that are not bearing a greater share of the burden of these environmental injustices?
Mm-hmm.
How do we get them to notice, and how do we get them to care?
I mean, I think it comes down to a lot of what the Black Lives Matter movement has been telling us in the last few years, that we have to, white people have to recognize their privilege, and they have to actually get to know people of color in other communities and in their own communities. The way that this region is so segregated actively prevents opportunities for that to happen. And it's a real problem. And, you have to really take an active step towards kind of fighting the not natural, but just the way things are, and the way that we move about the region. It's very easy to live in a bubble in Metro Detroit.
Yes. It is. It is easy to live in a bubble. And that surprises me sometimes, because we're all, what are we, like 5 million people in this region? And we move about constantly. You were talking about air pollution. A lot of that, some of that, don't know what percent of that has to come from driving around all the time.
I think more than we realize. And I also think we don't necessarily recognize that we are all exposed to a fair bit of air pollution. Mm-hmm. And it affects us over our lives.
It does.
My dad never smoked in his life, but for some reason he had COPD at the end of his life. And I don't know, he lived his life on the east side of Detroit, and there's a fair bit of air pollution there, and a fair bit of asthma, and I never really even thought about it.
Yes.
So it affects us.
Yeah, maybe it's getting people to realize how it affects them in a personal way. Maybe they haven't connected the dots. I do hope that more and more people subscribe to Planet Detroit and read every story that you publish every Friday. It comes out every Friday, and that the news that you are reporting becomes a part of our conversations as a region. Voices for Earth Justice is about getting on behalf of Earth. It's also about people engaging one another. Planet Detroit is really about giving people information and inspiration, I think, to think about and to be a part of those conversations. So you are a really, really important part of the work here in this region. And I hope everyone will go to planetdetroit.substack.com and subscribe right now. Nina, thank you for being, thank you for, that looks like your bed. So, there's your bed. Here's my couch. Thank you for letting us into your home today. Is there anything else you want to say? Anything you really feel like you need to say before we put the wraps on this historic first live stream?
Subscribe to the newsletter. We appreciate Voices for Earth Justice for supporting us. So thank you.
It's a pleasure. We love the work you do, and we hope more and more people support it as time goes by. So thank you. If you've been following along today on our live stream, thank you for being here. Just want to tell you here at the end that tomorrow is Earth Day. If you didn't know, I'm shocked. But tomorrow's Earth Day. We have a live stream at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, interfaith prayer and songs. To start your Earth Day off right. We'll also be having a panel discussion tomorrow at noon with 3 environmental nonprofit leaders here in Detroit, Green Living Science, EcoWorks, and Michigan Interfaith Power and Light. And we'll be talking about what does Earth Day mean in the age of COVID-19, and where do we go from here? Some of what Nina and I talked about today. And also, we are hosting a 24-hour virtual prayer vigil for Earth that starts at midnight tonight and runs until midnight tomorrow night. You can find out about these things at voicesforearth.org. That's voices, the number 4, earth.org. we hope to see you as a part of our Earth Day celebration tomorrow. And we do hope you celebrate and keep Earth Day no matter how you do it. So thank you for being part of our community. We are all together voices for Earth justice, and it is a pleasure to serve alongside you. Have a good evening.